Hi, this is Tim Staley, poet and educator from Las Cruces, New Mexico. I'm so thrilled to talk to you today about teaching poetry to your future students. On the first day that I teach poetry, I have students tell me their definitions of poetry. I'll share some of my favorite definitions, such as a poem is the best word in the best order, or poetry is the language of dreams. But ultimately, I'll tell them that there is no definition for poetry, and as soon as somebody does try to define it, another poet will come along, do exactly the opposite, and all of a sudden become a great, famous poet. Poetry keeps on changing, it's slippery, and no one can really pin it down, and that's one of the things that makes it so cool and so worth you teaching. The next thing I do is ask them to tell me why poetry sucks. I'll tell them to share with me stories of teachers who have ruined poetry for them, or poets who ruined it for them, and I'll listen and I'll agree with them sometimes. I'll acknowledge that poetry has some weaknesses. Yes, there are some poets that are overly complicated. Yes, there are some poems that are extremely boring. Yes, there are some poets that think they're going to be really smart by making their poems difficult to show off how smart they are. It's okay to acknowledge that. I tell them I read poetry every morning, but even if it's a poet that I love, I don't love every one of that poet's poems. I tell them that when I'm reading poetry just for fun, if I read the first 2 or 3 lines and I don't like it, I flip the page and I go to the next one. I can be a huge fan of poetry, but that doesn't mean I like every poem I read. After we do that, I then tell them that poetry, when you read poetry, it's kind of like slow motion reading. You might have heard this as like reading between the lines. I kind of like this idea of slow motion, because we might read the poem once and then you go back and you can look at it slower and you can really start to see where it resonates and what things are making meaning to you. If you don't understand 100% of a poem, that's okay. If you understand 20%, 30%, fine. Getting any understanding out of any poem is a huge success, and that's just great. I tell them that I like poetry because it's short and it's sweet. And in fact, I prefer 1-page poems to 3-page or 4-page poems. And I think that there's a poem out there for every single one of you, and there's a poet that speaks just directly to you and just directly in your language. You just have to find that person. You have to find that poet. And what that means is you need to read poetry. If you're afraid to teach poetry, well, one way to get over that is start just reading poetry as much as you can. And one place that I like to go is this website called Poetry Daily. And on that website, they post a new contemporary poem every day. And some of that stuff is really good, and you can get a sense of what's happening in modern American poetry right now. The poems that are in our textbooks are not the best poems in the world. The poems that are in our textbooks represent a little tiny slice of the American poetry scene. So, and with the poems that teachers have taught you in the past, that's not all poetry. So if you've never found one you like, it's okay. You will find one. Just keep looking. You might hear about these formulas like TP-Cast, and this is like this algorithm to break a poem down. What does the title mean? What does the tone? What's this and what's that? What's the author? Who's the author? All that. I don't think that's a good place to begin and end your analysis of poetry. If you want to use some type of formulaic thing, I guess you can, but don't stop there. I think the first thing that I do when I teach a poem is to meet the poem's humanity. What is this poem saying about the human condition? What emotion does it have? Is this about loneliness, happiness, greed? What is it saying about humans? Start there. And ultimately, when you're teaching a poem, you're teaching students how to critique art and how to define their own aesthetic. What the word aesthetic means is your individual definition of beauty. The things I find beautiful are very different than what you find beautiful and what your neighbor finds beautiful. So what we as teachers are doing is giving students the tools and the resources for them to figure out what they think is beautiful. And the way to do that is by giving them a bunch of different poems, trying to show them a variety of authors from a variety of races and sexes, and they'll find one, hopefully, and you might have converted a student to poetry, which is probably the best thing you can do. And here's why: because the Washington Post wrote an article recently that said that the only art form less popular than poetry is opera. And if we as teachers don't continue to push poetry and bring it in to the classroom and celebrate how cool it can be, then what's next? In 30 years, 40 years, what's going to happen to poetry? It's the opera is the only less popular thing. So poetry needs you. It really does need you. And if you don't give it to them, they're not going to see it. Unless they go to song lyrics. And speaking of song lyrics, I think song lyrics are a great way to get in to teaching poetry. There's websites like genius.com or Rap Genius that break down song lyrics more than people even break down Shakespeare. I think that song lyrics are a great way to get into thinking about poetry. So don't hesitate to talk about song lyrics. When I'm teaching a poem, what I decide to do is I decide on the poetry technique or tool that I want them to understand, and then I'll show them a poem. For example, the first thing I always introduce when it comes to poetry devices is concrete nouns. I think the biggest problem with young writers is their poems are full of abstractions. They're kind of emo. It's so dark. I'm so sad. I want to cut myself. The world's terrible. Everybody's mean. Blackness, darkness. Blah. What you want to do is have them focus in on concrete nouns. Give me a noun that a concrete noun that shows me sadness, darkness, grief. And so we'll explain concrete nouns. One good activity to do is have the student look around their classroom and write down concrete nouns that can only be found in that classroom. For example, I wouldn't write down a desk because all classrooms have desks. I wouldn't write down a projector because all classrooms have projectors. But maybe I would write down that this classroom has a watercolored hammer. Maybe I would write down that this classroom has a Poems for Life, piece of paper. That's something that only, or maybe this little yellow thing up here. No other classroom has that. So what we're teaching students in that exercise is finding the unique details about their surroundings. That's what makes poetry, not the cliche details, the unique details. That's what you're after. So we spend exercise writing all the concrete nouns. After they've practiced writing concrete nouns or finding concrete nouns in their room, it could be a bedroom too if you didn't want to do your classroom, then I'll share them a poem with concrete nouns. So I'm going to read you a poem by New York poet Frank O'Hara, and I want you to listen for the concrete nouns. Personal poem. Now when I walk around at lunchtime, I have only two charms in my pocket. An old Roman coin Mike Kanumitsu gave me, and a bolt head that broke off a parking case when I was in Madrid. The others never brought me too much luck, though they did help me in New York against coercion. But now I'm happy, for a time, and interested. I walk through the luminous humidity, passing the house of Seagram, with its wet and its loungers, and the construction to the left that closed the sidewalk. If I ever get to be a construction worker, I'd like to have a silver hat, please. And get to Moriarty's, where I wait for Leroy, and hear who wants to be a mover and shaker. The last 5 years, my batting average is .016, that's that. And Leroy comes in and tells me Miles Davis was clubbed 12 times last night outside Birdland by a cop. A lady asks us for a nickel for a terrible disease, but we don't give her one. We don't like terrible diseases. Then we go eat some fish and some ale. It's cool but crowded. We don't like Lionel Trilling. We decide we like Don Allen. We don't like Henry James so much. We like Herman Melville. We don't want to be in the Poets' Walk in San Francisco even. We just want to be rich and walk on girders in our silver hats. I wonder if one person out of the 8 million is thinking of me as I shake hands with Leroy and buy a strap for my wristwatch and go back to work, happy at the thought, possibly so. So I want you to take a look at that poem, see if you can find the concrete nouns, and then I want you to write a poem where you are using as many concrete nouns, as many specific things as you can find. Celebrate the objects of the world. That's step one in writing a good poem. I look forward to seeing your poems. This has been Tim Staley. Over and out.